On February 14, 2020, Anitra Gunn, a driven 23-year-old college student, suddenly vanished without a trace. Just a day before, she had been texting her friends, eagerly anticipating graduation and the opportunities ahead. But that morning, everything took a dark turn. There were mysterious messages from her phone, completely unlike her usual tone. She said she was on her way to meet a man, but she never mentioned who. And then, complete silence. No one had heard from Anitra Gunn since. Her father, Christopher Gunn, knew something was wrong. He immediately left Atlanta, driving nearly 125 miles to Fort Valley where his daughter was studying. At the same time, police began investigating and searching. What they didn't realize was that they were about to step into a case filled with darkness, manipulation, and death, a story that would shake all of Georgia. A few days later, police found Anitra's white Chevrolet Cruze, abandoned not far from her home. The front bumper was missing, and the tires were covered in mud. Inside, her purse and keys were still there, but there was no sign of Anitra. Now, there was no doubt, this was no ordinary missing person case, and then, a name emerged: Demarcus Little, her ex-boyfriend. A man with a promising future, a disciplined soldier. But also the last person to see Anitra Gunn alive. What really happened on that fateful Valentine's Day? And what dark secrets are waiting to be uncovered? Anitra Gunn was an ambitious young woman. At 23, she was in her final year at Fort Valley State University, majoring in agriculture, a field she was truly passionate about. She balanced her studies with a part-time job at a local restaurant, striving for independence and refusing to rely on anyone. Losing her mother at a young age, Anitra never let that pain defeat her. She was strong, cheerful, and always radiated positive energy to those around her. But there was one thing few people knew: she was trying to escape a dangerous relationship. Her ex-boyfriend, Demarcus Little, was an Army sergeant. At first, he seemed like a responsible man, but over time, his jealousy and controlling nature became suffocating. Anitra wasn't herself when she was with him. Friends noticed the tension in their relationship, but she never spoke much about it. There were times when she tried to walk away from Demarcus, but he always found a way back, always convincing her that things could get better. In recent months, Anitra had truly changed. She laughed more, went out more, and seemed to be enjoying life without anyone controlling her. Those close to her believed she had finally let go of the past. She had plans for the future. Graduation was approaching, and she was considering moving elsewhere to start a new chapter in life. But perhaps someone didn't want her to leave. On February 14, 2020, Anitra disappeared. That morning, her closest friends received strange messages from her phone, messages that didn't sound like her at all. When they tried calling back, her phone was turned off. That had never happened before. Anitra was always in touch with people. She wasn't the type to suddenly go silent. All day, there was no word from Anitra. By evening, worry turned into fear. Her father, Christopher Gunn, drove 125 miles from Atlanta to Fort Valley, contacted the police, and started searching for her. But when authorities arrived, they made a chilling discovery: Anitra's car was abandoned not far from her home. The front bumper was missing, the tires were covered in mud. Her purse and keys were still inside, but her phone was gone. This wasn't a typical missing person case. Someone had tried to cover their tracks, but not completely. And as the police began narrowing down the list of suspects, one name quickly emerged: Demarcus Little, the former lover who was the last person to see Anitra Gunn alive. The question remains: did Anitra disappear on her own? Or did someone decide that if he couldn't have her, no one else could? The last messages: on February 14, 2020, Anitra Gunn vanished. A day meant to symbolize love turned into a fateful day for the young woman. That morning, Sierra Stewart, Anitra's best friend, woke up late and checked her phone. She saw a message from Anitra, short and simple, "Happy Valentine's Day." But soon after, things started to seem off. Anitra mentioned that she was going to meet a man, but she didn't say who. This wasn't like her. She had never hinted at meeting anyone outside of her complicated relationship with Demarcus Little, her ex-boyfriend. Sierra felt uneasy but tried to brush it off, thinking maybe Anitra was just joking, but then, Anitra's phone went silent. Messages from friends were left unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. All communication suddenly stopped. This was unusual. Anitra always kept in touch, always responded, especially on a day like this. That afternoon, David Scoot Howard, an acquaintance of Anitra, also received a strange text from her number. But when he replied, the response was cold and distant, completely unlike Anitra's usual way of speaking. And then, like a nightmare unfolding, her phone went dead. Feeling something was terribly wrong, Sierra reached out to Anitra's father, Christopher Gunn. Without hesitation, he got in his car and drove 125 miles from Atlanta to Fort Valley, a journey filled with fear and worry. Upon arriving, he reported his daughter missing to the police. Authorities immediately launched an investigation. They went to Anitra's home, but there were no signs of her, the doors were locked, and no one answered. Then, a disturbing discovery brought everything to a halt. Anitra's white Chevrolet Cruze was found abandoned not far from her home. Something wasn't right about the car. The front bumper was missing, the tires were caked in mud, as if it had been driven down a rough, muddy road. But what was even more chilling, her purse and keys were still inside, yet her phone was gone. Someone had taken her. And wasn't letting her come back. Immediately, police began narrowing down potential suspects. And the first name that came to mind was none other than Demarcus Little, the man who had once controlled Anitra's life, the man who refused to accept that she was leaving him. Was he involved in her disappearance? If so, where was Anitra? And most importantly, was she still alive? A trail of secrets. The Fort Valley police didn't take long to realize that this wasn't a typical missing person case. A young woman had vanished without a trace, her phone was turned off, her car abandoned under mysterious circumstances, yet there were no signs of an accident or a robbery. So where was Anitra Gunn? And who was the last person to see her? They started piecing together the puzzle of that day. The last phone calls, the strange text messages, the abandoned car, all led to one crucial question: who was Anitra with last? And immediately, the name Demarcus Little appeared. Demarcus was no stranger. He was Anitra's ex-boyfriend, a 22-year-old Army sergeant stationed at Fort Eisenhower, formerly Fort Gordon, in Augusta. A man who seemed serious about his career, but his relationship with Anitra wasn't as perfect as people thought. When police came to question Demarcus, he didn't seem too surprised. He said that on the night of February 13th, Anitra had stayed at his aunt's house in Chestnut Hill. They spent the night there, and the next morning, on February 14th, Anitra left around 11:30 a.m., saying she had a job interview to attend. But there was a problem. Anitra's interview had actually been scheduled for 9:30 a.m. If she left at 11:30 a.m., why was she late? Why hadn't she told anyone? Why was there no record of anyone seeing her after that? Police began questioning Demarcus's story. But he stuck to it. He claimed he had no idea what had happened to Anitra. However, other clues started emerging. One of Demarcus's close friends, Javon Abram, was brought in for questioning. When asked about the night before Anitra's disappearance, Javon said he had driven Demarcus and Anitra to her house at around 2 a.m. so she could get her car. After that, they went out for a late-night meal. This matched Demarcus's account. But strangely enough, no one saw Anitra after that. Then, a disturbing discovery surfaced. Anitra's phone had been thrown into a storm drain near Carver Road, just a few miles from where she was reported missing. At this point, police began to feel a growing sense of unease. A girl doesn't just vanish like this. If someone had made her disappear, that person had likely been with her in her final hours. The details were stacking up, and the picture was starting to form. Demarcus Little said he didn't know what had happened to Anitra. But the evidence was beginning to suggest otherwise. The question was no longer where is Anitra? Now, it was, is Demarcus Little truly innocent? A chilling discovery. On February 18, 2020, after days of desperate searching, a horrifying breakthrough occurred. A patrol officer from the Peach County Sheriff's Office noticed a small dirt path, marked by tire tracks, leading into a wooded area. Curious, he ventured deeper, stepping over fallen branches. And then, he saw it. Beneath dried leaves and scattered twigs, a partial human body was exposed. At the scene, police immediately secured the area. After examination, there was no doubt, it was Anitra Gunn. She was dead, carelessly hidden among the trees, as if someone had tried to conceal her but didn't care enough to do it properly. The autopsy report revealed that Anitra had been strangled to death. There were no stab wounds or gunshot injuries, but bruises on her body suggested she had been beaten before being strangled. Investigators also noted that her body appeared to have been dragged across the ground, indicating that she wasn't killed at the scene but was moved there in an attempt to hide her remains. Then, a crucial piece of evidence surfaced. A fragment of the front bumper from Anitra's 2013 white Chevrolet Cruze was found near her body. When Anitra had last driven her car, it was undamaged. This meant that someone else had driven it after her death, and while disposing of her body, the vehicle must have struck something, causing the bumper to break off. At this point, police had no more doubts. They turned their attention to the one man who had been closely connected to Anitra in her final hours, Demarcus Little. But what shocked everyone even more was the confession of Demarcus's close friend, Javon Abram. During interrogation, after relentless questioning, Javon lowered his head and sighed. Then, he said it was time to tell the truth. According to Javon's statement, on the afternoon of February 16, Demarcus had called him to go for a drive. While in the car, Demarcus made a chilling confession: "I strangled her. I don't know what happened. I told her we were meant to be together. She laughed at me. Then, I lost control." Demarcus's confession cut through the lies like a knife. He hadn't killed Anitra as part of a calculated plan. It was a moment of blind rage, anger over the fact that she no longer wanted him. Javon testified that after killing Anitra, Demarcus placed her body in his trunk, drove into the woods, dumped her beneath some trees, and then threw her phone into a storm drain to erase any evidence. Once finished, he drove Anitra's car back to her house, leaving it behind with the damaged bumper, then pretended he had no idea what had happened. With Javon's testimony, Demarcus Little had nowhere left to run. The truth was finally exposed, and the only thing left now was justice for Anitra Gunn. The truth comes out. After finding Anitra Gunn's body, police had no doubt Demarcus Little was the killer. He was arrested on February 19, 2020, initially charged with criminal damage to property, after Anitra had previously reported that her tires had been slashed and her windows had been smashed, acts believed to have been committed by Demarcus. But just days later, as the evidence continued to mount, police formally charged him with murder and aggravated assault. In March 2022, Demarcus Little stood trial in Peach County, Georgia. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: GPS data, threatening text messages from Demarcus, and the testimony of Javon Abram, who revealed that Demarcus had confessed to strangling Anitra to death in a fit of rage. Text messages between Anitra and Demarcus also exposed the controlling and violent nature of their relationship. Anitra had tried to leave Demarcus, but he wouldn't let her go. In one message, he wrote, "If I can't have you, no one can." Javon's testimony, along with forensic evidence on Anitra's body and Demarcus's actions on February 14, painted the full picture of the crime. It took the jury only 3 hours to reach a final verdict: Demarcus Little was guilty. When the judge sentenced Demarcus Little to life in prison without parole, he lowered his head, unable to remain composed. He knew he would never see freedom again. In the courtroom, Anitra's father, Christopher Gunn, stood in silence. He had lost his daughter, but at least he knew that the man who took her life would never harm anyone else. Anitra Gunn's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a warning about domestic violence. Signs of control, jealousy, and manipulation are often overlooked, but they can escalate into deadly consequences. Justice was served, but at the cost of a young woman's life. And the biggest question we must ask ourselves is, how many more Anitra Gunns are out there, still struggling to escape? A deadly warning. Anitra Gunn's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a warning. She was not the only one trapped in a toxic, controlling relationship with no way out. Her story is a heartbreaking example of how relationship violence doesn't start with fists, it starts with manipulation, jealousy, and control. Anitra tried to leave Demarcus Little, but like many victims, she was pulled back by apologies, promises, and even threats. The terrifying reality is that the warning signs had been there for a long time, but many people failed to recognize how dangerous they were, until it was too late. The issue isn't just Demarcus Little, it's how society perceives relationship violence. We often dismiss the early signs, threatening messages, irrational jealousy, excessive control, as just part of relationships. But if there's one lesson to take from Anitra Gunn's tragedy, it's this: violence isn't just bruises, it can be words, small actions, and patterns that, over time, turn into a deadly cycle.